Well, kia ora i te whānau no mai, haere mai, how are we? Good, some of us are awake. Did anyone get up at 5 a.m. to watch the high jump? I know one person in this room did, and that's my husband. Good for him. I stayed sound asleep. Like Will said, who's just praying for my physical well-being, I'm hapu with twins, which is wild. Thanks. But I also am just battling a chest infection. So you're just going to have to be patient with me if I take a deep breath or if I take longer to communicate than I usually would. There are 3 of us on board today, and it's just a wild time. So we're going to do what we can and trust the Lord to make up the rest, which he is good at doing. Like Will said, we're in a brand new series which is going to span the next 3 weeks called Let There Be Light. And it comes with a trigger warning. We're talking about the subject of trauma, which is a pretty gnarly topic to try and unpack. And for some of us, that will feel incredibly uncomfortable because of our story or where we're at right now. And the intent of this message in this series isn't to make us uncomfortable, isn't to try and bring up hard stuff for the sake of it, but to see the hope in the midst of the darkness, to see the power of Jesus for our situation and where we're at. And so if you need to do something to care for yourself this morning, I'm giving you full permission. If you need to take a deep breath and ground yourself, if you need to invite the Lord to come and sit with you, if you need to just float away to a different place in your brain. There aren't many preachers that say tune out if you need to, but feel free to. Because as much as I think this is helpful and full of hope, it may feel a bit too much. So do whatever is required to care for you. We also want to add care as much as we can. So after the service, we have our prayer team who are incredible, who would love to partner with you if that's important. We have a prayer team that prays throughout the week that your story or just even your name could be added to if that would feel powerful for you. We have life groups, like we've already talked about, that are such a good place for care and connection. And so maybe something in this series might trigger you to have a bit of a yarn with your life group leader and see what support they might be able to offer. We also have a counselling service, which is me, and I'm not everyone's cup of tea. So if you feel like therapy is the next step for you, but you don't want to talk to me, I won't be offended, but I have a list of people who might be a better fit. And so just get in touch and I can refer you on to someone who might work for you. So there's a whole lot of ways we want to care for you. But I also acknowledge that some of us don't necessarily feel like we need care. We might be more curious. We might want to learn a little bit more about this topic. And so I've also collated a strong list of resources if you want to learn a little bit more. That'll be available throughout the series, but if you want it earlier rather than later, just flick me an email and I'll send that to you as well. Is that cool? We have a whole lot of ways to care for you. We have more info if you want it. And this week, today, really just sets up where we're going over the next 2 weeks. So we're going to be seeking to understand what is this thing of trauma, how does it impact a person, and why is it important within the church setting? And then next week, we're going to look at what does this mean for me personally? What are some of the things I might need to take stock of or that I might need to do in my next steps? And then the third week means what does this look like outwardly? As a community, as people, what do we do about the things that we've been learning and how can we be a resource to those around us? So I'm going to pray and we're going to crack on into it. Lord, we just acknowledge your presence. We acknowledge your proximity and your closeness to us. And Lord, I pray that you would do what exactly you desire in this space. Lord, you know each of our needs and each of our stories. And I pray that your Spirit would translate these words to be exactly what we need to hear. And you'd edit out anything that isn't of you. We pray that in this space you'd be glorified, you'd be honored, and your name would be exalted. In your mighty name, amen. Let there be light. Stems out of a verse that we find in John and in 1 John that talks about the light shines in the darkness and the darkness has not overcome it. And as Jesus followers, what we have come to understand and why this verse is so powerful and important is that Jesus is that light. He shines in the darkness and he cannot be overpowered. He cannot be outnumbered. He cannot be outdone. And we know this because of what happened on the cross. And so we see through the story in the life of Jesus that he dies a really excruciating death on the cross. And it looks like in that moment when he breathes his last breath that the darkness has won. It looks like the enemy has the upper hand, and they take Jesus' body off the cross, they bury him in the tomb. But 3 days later, he comes back to life. 3 days later, he defeats the darkness. He withstands death, and he shows it who is boss. And that is how we have such hope in Jesus being our light, and Jesus being the promised one, and Jesus being the solution in the darkness. Now, if you're new to church and you're going, that's awesome, if that was so true, why is there still pain and suffering? Why is there still this dark stuff going on right now? And what we know as followers of Jesus is that the promise is that he's going to return, that he's actually coming back for his people. And when he does so, he promises to wipe every tear from our eyes, to right every wrong, to restore every injustice, to be the healer and the governor of all of creation as he has been destined to be. And in that moment, everything will be made right. And we long for that. We wait for that. We work towards that. But we exist right now in the age of the church. And the age of the church is so that people have the option to come to have faith in Jesus, which means that darkness still has a bit of power. It means that sin and evilness is still pervasive in our world. And I don't think any of us need to be taught what that means. One of the most common human experiences is that of suffering. You and I know what it is to hurt. And so the promise is that in this time, there are two things that we as the church have on our plate. One is to come to know Jesus if we haven't already, and to enter into that light and to enter into the freedom that he gives us. But the second is to go and be the light, to go into those dark places and bring about the hope in which we have in Jesus. And so over the next few weeks, we're going to look at that for me personally and that for me outwardly. I know this to be true. I know that Jesus is the light. I know that he is our hope, because the battle between light and darkness is as old as time. The battle between good and evil. And we know that Jesus has the victory, but we stand in the middle ground. And what I wanted to do as we talk about this from a spiritual perspective is bring it a little bit down into our context. What's happening right here and now. This is where some of the triggering stuff gets said. So steel yourselves if that feels difficult. When we look at our statistics here in Aotearoa just at the moment, we know that 1/3 of all couples will engage in domestic violence of some kind. 1/3. Imagine if I asked 1/3 of us to stand up right now. And what we often think of as in the church in particular is like, that doesn't happen here. That's not our story. I believe that statistic is probably accurate in this space as well. Some of us are just really good at hiding it. And so if 1/3 of all couples can engage in domestic violence at some point in their relational history or kind of lifespan, what does that mean for us? What does that mean for you? We also know that 1 in 3 women, 1 in 5 children, and roughly 1 in 5 men will encounter sexual abuse throughout their lifetime. That is a huge number and a significant trauma. We know that New Zealand has the highest teen suicide rate in the developed world. And we rank 35th out of 41 countries for child wellbeing outcomes in the developed world. That means that every 5 weeks, 1 child dies in New Zealand due to child abuse or neglect. This is happening in our backyard. If you've been keeping an eye on the media, you know that within the last month, the Royal Commission Inquiry of Abuse in State Care and Faith Communities was published, and it is horrific. 250,000 people between the years of 1950 to 1999 that encountered abuse within the care as vulnerable people that others were responsible for administering. We know that even this year, the Gloriavale Utopia documentary was released, and we see sometimes in these church communities that become culty, I'm going to be very clear about Gloriavale, that there are people who use the name of God for their own agenda. And in so doing, they take a whole lot of lives with them. This is rife. Trauma is not a minority issue. It is a majority issue. And as difficult as it is, as uncomfortable as it is, the church has to be equipping people in it. Because we need to know how to spot it, and we need to know how to respond to it. How to actually be people of the light, how to be helpful, how to be equipping, but also how to care for ourselves. How do we make sure that we are okay and that we continue to center Jesus in our lives? And so all of this doom and gloom and kind of yuck stuff is to help us understand that trauma is a diverse experience, that it is a majority issue, that upwards of 65% of adults will encounter something traumatic throughout their lives. And in therapy, we talk about it in two different ways. A capital T trauma, which is the big event, and it can be one-off, but it has this ripple effect and impact on a person's well-being. And then the little t trauma, and that's usually smaller events that are repetitive, but continue to be distressing and have a lasting impact. And the way that I describe trauma, and there are a lot of experts that will kind of plug into, and they define it a lot better, but my definition is that it's the emotional response that best describes the lasting impacts, and hear that it is ongoing, of distressing and disturbing events in which we didn't have control or in which we felt our survival was threatened. As human beings, we are hardwired to survive. Safety is paramount. And what happens in a traumatic state is that safety is threatened. And we're going to look a little bit about what's happening in the brain and kind of how this whole thing works. But at its core, it's a safety concern. And so that means that we need to look at what does it take and what does it require to keep a person safe and to help us feel safe. I really like Bessel van der Kolk's work. He is kind of a leading trauma expert in the field. I think I like him because he's Dutch and I'm Dutch, and it sounds like I'm listening to my Oma when he talks. But he says, we have learned that trauma is not just an event that took place sometime in the past. It's also the imprint left by that event or experience on the mind, the body, and the brain. This imprint has ongoing consequences for how the human organism manages to survive in the present. So it's a past issue living and impacting the present. Trauma results in a fundamental reorganization of the way the mind and brain manage perceptions, the way they see the world. It changes not only how we think and what we think about, but it also our very capacity to think. This is so important. Often someone in a hyper-traumatic state makes decisions and actions that don't make sense to someone who isn't in that same state. And we judge it and we go, what were you thinking? Why would you do that? And in essence, they weren't thinking in the way you were, because their cortex, their frontal cortex, all their logical, executive function, their decision-making, where all of that stuff happens, which we joke we know in teenagers isn't online yet, which explains some of their choice behaviors, mine included at that time. We wonder why it doesn't quite stack up, why it's not so wise. It's because that part of their brain is offline so that they can survive. And if you are stuck in that traumatic response, accessing your logic is really difficult. And I say this because I want us to be people who are compassionate and curious rather than judgmental. Rather than assuming that someone's broken or something's so wrong with them, it's going, why did they make that choice? Why was that not what I would have done? What maybe has led to that? Because their brain is not functioning in the way that maybe yours is. I like that Bessel van der Kolk also talks about trauma is not just what happens to us, but what we hold inside in the absence of an empathetic witness. What he's saying is it's not just that we encountered this really hard event, it's that we were alone in it. Is that no one supported us and cared for us. No one listened and sounded out or validated what we had experienced, and we were left with that alone. And what any of us know when it comes to difficult things is that we are more likely to stay silent about it than we are to be spoken. And so if part of the solution is someone who is safe and will listen and validate what's going on, that's actually not such a hard ask, and it could dramatically change the outcomes for some people. Peter Levine, another expert in the field, says that trauma is a fact of life. It does not, however, have to be a life sentence. It's changeable. If we are to sit with people, if we are to offer care, if we are to resource them for their own healing and well-being, everything can change. And I love this. We're going to talk about this a lot in week 3, but that's our job as the church, to be safe people who can support and empower someone in their own well-being and journey, because this doesn't have to destroy them. Another quote is that our capacity to destroy one another is matched by our capacity to heal one another. Yes, humanity can be awful, but gosh, she can be beautiful, and she can change the story for so many. And that's the type of person I want to be. And that's the story I see Jesus be time and time again. So it's heavy, hey? But it's filled with so much hope. So let me talk you through what's happening in the brain for someone who's encountering trauma. So on a very basic level, our brain is broken up into a few different parts, and I've highlighted just 3. The prefrontal cortex, which we talked about just before. Then in our midbrain, we have our amygdala, which is responsible for all our emotions and threat risk, so it's kind of scanning for where things are going. And then we have our hippocampus, which is responsible for our memory storage. And often what happens for someone in trauma is that the work between the amygdala and the hippocampus gets a little bit distorted. And one of the defining diagnoses of something like PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, is that the past is living in the present as though it was still happening. And so between the amygdala and the hippocampus, things have got a little bit crossed. But within the amygdala, where all our emotions and our threat risk is happening, is a very primitive part of our brain, which is wired for survival. And it's where you've probably heard before we talk about survival responses. Fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. Have we heard these before? Yeah? Cool. Some of us have heard it, some of us are learning it. And essentially, it's our brain's way of looking at a risk and going, how can I get out of this? How can I stay alive? How can I protect myself? And a lot of people talk about it being similar to being in a cave kind of a couple 100,000 years ago, and there's a lion in front of you, and your brain is going, this is dangerous. My life's at risk. What can I do to protect myself? Some people respond by fighting it off. And we might know those people. We might be those people. Other people respond by flight, so fleeing, running away from the threat. We also, again, could be those people. But then there's also the freeze. And we see that happen, the classic deer in the headlights kind of image that we say. Like they're frozen, hoping that the car will just divert around them. Often they still get hit by the car, right? The collision still happens. But its brain is going, this will keep me safe if I just freeze and play dead for a moment. And then the latest addition is fawn. And this is a lot more related to emotional and relational dynamics. But fawning is when I just take all the blame. If I just over-apologize, if I take responsibility, if I'm the issue, then I can deal with that and the threat can get diminished. We see that happen in a dynamic with a relationship where someone's really explosive and angry and someone goes, oh, I'm so sorry, I just shouldn't have done that, I'll never do that again. That's a survival instinct to manage a really threatening moment. Now, what our brains are not so good at doing is distinguishing, is that threat in front of me a physical threat or is it an emotional threat? And so whether it's one of the two, our amygdala lights up. And as it does that, our prefrontal cortex shuts down. It stops functioning because the time difference between what's happening emotionally and physically to what I might do about that, it's too slow for our survival instinct. So it has to be reduced. Does that make sense? Okay, you guys are keeping up. You're doing well. And what's crazy interesting when we talk about someone who's stuck in a trauma state is their amygdala is hyper-focused. Their whole perception is that everything is a risk to me. Everything could take me out. And so I have to be hyper-vigilant about that. And their prefrontal cortex is shut down a lot of the time. And when we talk about healing this, when we talk about the change, the big thing we want to do is how do we help a person feel safe in their body and safe in their mind so that they can reduce their survival instinct and move into thriving. It's not just surviving. And that is the heart of Jesus, is that he came to give life and life in all its fullness. Not that we just scrape by, not that we just exist, but that we thrive in our environment. We thrive in our family dynamic. We thrive in who we are. And some of us need a little extra support to be able to dim the survival instinct and move into that thriving. I'm a really big believer that there are a lot of ways we could do that and that Jesus is part of the story, but we also have incredible medical and psychological experts and professionals who can help us with that. And so I'm a take every tool I can get kind of gal if it's going to help a person. I think what's really interesting about this is that some of us might have experienced something traumatic. And so has someone else that we know. So two people can live the exact same experience, but the outcome in them can be vastly different. Has anyone kind of witnessed that or lived that? And what I have a tendency to do is to judge that other person who seems to be struggling a little bit more and go, well, I lived that. I'm fine. I managed. It's part of the story. It wasn't very fun, but I trucked on. And what's really tricky is that our brains do the best that they can with the information they have at the time. And sometimes that will look like more distressing symptoms in one than it is in the other. And so what we have to do is take our judgment off people who are experiencing traumatic symptoms and actually be really curious as to, man, what was happening in your brain, in your body? Why was that difficult for you? And so we talk a lot in therapy about the capital T trauma and the little t trauma, the big distressing events and the more repetitive ones. The brain is doing the very best that it can, and our job post-trauma, like I said before, is to help the body and brain know that it's safe and to move from surviving to thriving. What's tricky about a topic like this is that there is a whole lot of events in life we can't control, that we have no ability to change, things that just happen in an instant. And we can't predict a lot of those things, and we actually aren't responsible for other people's actions. But what we are responsible for is our actions, our response, our behavior. And one of the things I want us to continue to see is that when we talk about light and darkness, there is a choice here of which side we choose and how we act that out. And so on the next slide, one of the images I have is that at one end we have extreme abuse. If we're talking just about a person's behavior, a person's choice, they could induce extreme abuse at the disregard of someone else's well-being and their outcomes. But then we have this other scale, acts of violence. And when I hear violence, immediately my initial thought is that's pretty extreme. That's actually not okay. But when we really break down and define what violence means, it means to be destructive, to tear down. And I think we could all say that there are times we have chosen words that are destructive, that tear a person down rather than build them up. Or maybe the things that we say to ourselves are destructive rather than building and helpful. And this is where I think we have a lot of choice, to begin to take stock of our own behavior and go, hey, am I being more helpful or am I actually being more harmful? And we can do a whole lot of work about why that is and how we could change that. But that's the first invitation I think we need to begin to look at. Am I helping people or am I harming them? Which side do I sit on? Where this gets tricky is that one of the key parts of trauma, like I said earlier, is it's a person sitting alone in their pain. And we need really safe and robust people to help us in that. And what I'm not telling you, hear me loud and clear, is that you now need to go and tell everyone about your trauma. Did you know this happened to me? And then the other person goes, yeah, me too. And it becomes what we call trauma bonding, which is yuck, not a good thing. Try to avoid it if you can. We want to talk to safe and trusted people. We want to talk to people who actually can respond with empathy and with validation. And this is my story. I so remember one of the first kind of big traumas that I encountered as a 19-year-old. I had no idea what to do with that, and I was feeling all sorts of ways. And so I stayed silent for quite a while. And then I thought, I'll tell my best friend, because that's what we do, hey? The person we've known the longest or we love the most, I'll tell them, surely that will be the right choice. She was also 19. She had no clue how to respond to something pretty difficult. And she laughed when I told her what had happened. And that kept me silent for another 3 years because I was so embarrassed that this thing that I found really painful was laughable to someone else. And so we actually have to look for safe people, people who will validate, people who will empathize, people who will say, my goodness, that must have been so tough. And for me, that person was a few years older than me with a little bit more maturity that 3 years later. And then my healing could begin. But until we share that, until we actually bring that to the light, until we follow that invitation of Jesus, we're stuck in it. And we're surviving, but we sure as heck are not thriving. And so to be able to draw closer to Jesus, to see the light that shines in the darkness, we need to know that there's some trustworthy people around. We need to look for them. And I encourage you to be really particular about that person. There may be someone in your life who is that person, but there might not be. And that's where we say, talk to a professional, because they will actually give you a good response. Hopefully. But the idea is that we need to share some of this stuff with safe and trusted people. That's the invitation of Jesus to shine light in the darkness. And when we talk about our own choice, when we talk about our own actions, and we bring it back to this image of light and dark, our actions of darkness are always in opposition to the way of Jesus. It is never how he talked. It is never how he acted. It is never how he responded to people. That is a defining factor of what is dark. But the way of Jesus will always look like loving action towards others and towards God. So it's actually super simple, that our response and our choice to walk in the light will look like loving people, loving ourselves, and loving the Lord. But our opposition to that will be in the darkness. It will fail to reflect Jesus, and it will fail to mirror who he is and what he offers to humanity. And that's our choice. That's our invitation of how we might walk through that. In church, I'm so firmly convinced that the cost of not walking in the light is actually too high. That for some of us, we carry that lasting impact of that cost around as if it is still happening in the present. And Jesus' invitation is to bring that into the light and see how he will meet you in that, and see how he will be part of restoring and bringing you to freedom. And so if we were to imagine for a moment that the whole room went dark, just imagine. It's magic. This is the time where I get to see who's on their phone. It's very handy. But you can't see who's next to you, right? Not easily. Your eyes are starting to adjust. Maybe you can make it out. But all of a sudden, our brain is going, what is going on here? I'm a little concerned. And so our amygdala is starting to flare up and go, hey, what's the risk? What's happening? If you're a parent, you might be grabbing your kid and making sure that they're close to you. But all of a sudden, this got a little bit scary. Imagine that we had just one light in this space. And all of a sudden, like, I can see a few more faces. And you can maybe make out who's next to you. And it doesn't feel so scary. But it also sets the direction of where you're supposed to go. Hey, over here, here's the light shining in the darkness. And the promise of Jesus is that the battery will never run out. That he's not going to just disappear and get tired and go, oh, you're taking too long, I'm giving up. He will always shine in the dark place. He will never fail to be the beacon of hope and light that we need him to be. And here's where this gets crazy. I know you've all got a phone in your hand or in your pocket. If you get that out and turn your torch on, let's see what happens in this space. We can see a whole lot more, hey? And your view isn't as great as my view because now the room's lit up. But this is the power of the church, that we stand in the darkness and we hold up the light and we say, hey, here's Jesus. Here's the solution. Here's the hope. Here's what you need. See how it will change your life. And so throughout this series, this is what we come back to every single time, that Jesus stands in the darkness and he lights it up. And then he invites you and I to do exactly the same. We can put those away. Isn't that powerful? When we see what this actually looks like, when we see how this might feel. And you and I, on a daily basis, will have the opportunity to be people of the light in the darkness. My prayer is that we have eyes to see the chance, and we have hearts to respond to that. And we take stock of what we might need in order to be effective in that. The band's going to come up and we're going to respond to this content with worship. And this song helps us to center our eyes on Jesus, the one who stands in the darkness. And there's a poem that I love. I've shared it before at church, so I'm just going to do the second half. But when we think about being people who long for Jesus to return, for the day where every wrong is made right, where suffering is no more, this is what speaks to it. We wait for the Lord, our beloved, our comforter, master, and friend, the substance of all that we hope for, beginning of faith and its end. We watch for our Savior and bridegroom, who loved us and made us his own. For him we are looking and longing, for Jesus and Jesus alone. And if you don't know that Jesus yet, if you feel like your life is in the darkness, we would love to have a chat with you. We would love and be privileged to introduce you to the Jesus who lights up the hard stuff. But for those of us who know him, for those of us who have said yes to Jesus a long time ago, I wonder what sits with you, and I wonder what you need to work out and reflect on with the Lord. So if you feel like singing, if that feels right for you, you can stand to your feet. And if you want to sit and meditate on that, you can do that too. But we're going to worship. We're going to tell Jesus how we love him, and we're going to set our eyes on him, the author, the perfecter, the hope of our faith. Would you stand with me?